The times of February 1978 were completely different from today's world. Jimmy Carter was the President of America, and the radio was playing the famous song Staying Alive by the Bee Gees. This was a time when cars were made of heavy steel, had rear-wheel drive, and lacked technology like traction control. People didn't have mobile phones to check the weather app for hurricane news, nor were there 24-hour news channels that constantly issued warnings. People had only the morning newspaper, their car's AM radio, and the dark gray sky over their heads. The morning of February 6th dawned as usual in the Ohio Valley and New England areas. Alarms blared in the darkness. People made coffee in old-fashioned percolators, donned heavy wool coats, and after scraping the snow from the windshields of their cars, went about their business. Weathermen had lamented the snowfall, which was a common occurrence there in February, so no one cared much. But no one, not the weather forecasters, the government, or the millions of people driving their cars on the highway, had any idea what was going to happen. Nature was creating a trap from which it was impossible to escape. Two very strong and powerful weather systems were rapidly moving towards each other. On one side, a storm of cold and dry winds was coming down from Canada, like a hail of snow, and on the other side, a hot and humid cloud was moving up from the Gulf of Mexico. The two were to meet right above the Ohio Valley, and there a weather storm was to unfold, the likes of which hadn't been seen in centuries. Air pressure was about to drop as rapidly as is typically seen in hurricanes. By evening, people's familiar homes, their roads to their homes, and entire cities would be gone. The enemy wasn't the army. It was the wind and the snow that would bring America to its knees for the next week. This storm didn't make much noise when it arrived, but it started with a thud. On the morning of February 6th, it was raining in many areas. It was a cold and strange downpour that caught people off guard. The rain meant the weather was still warm enough for the snow to freeze. People thought the roads were just wet, not slippery, and everything was under control. People were looking out of their office windows at 10 a.m. and seeing gray, wet roads. They were thinking about dinner and the coming weekend. They weren't thinking about survival, but the trap had tightened around them. During the day, a sudden downpour of heat descended, and it didn't just fall, it crashed. Within an hour, the rain turned into tiny flakes of snow that pelted the windows like bullets. Then these flakes turned into heavy snow. But this wasn't the soft, beautiful snow that looks good in movies. It was heavy, wet, and hard as concrete. And then the wind came. Wind speeds reached 50, then 60, then 70 miles an hour. In coastal areas, gusts of wind reached 100 miles per hour. This weather change was so sudden and severe that the weather department couldn't even update its forecast. People in Cleveland and Boston reported that their ears were getting blocked due to the change in air pressure. The morning rain had now settled on the roads in the form of black ice, and on top of that glass-like snow, new snow was accumulating at a rate of 3 to 4 inches per hour. The deception was over, and the attack had begun. The real trouble began in the afternoon when this weather phenomenon turned into a battlefield. Since it was Monday, schools were full, factories were running, and offices were busy. When the sky turned black and snow obscured the windows, everyone decided at the same time, "I have to go home now." Millions of vehicles simultaneously took to the highways, and this was the mistake that caused the devastation. Traffic on Boston's Gridiron Route 128 first slowed, then stopped, and then was buried in snow. This wasn't a simple traffic jam, it was a slow-motion disaster. The snow was falling so fast that the road-clearing machines, called plows, were completely useless. They would clear one lane, and 5 minutes later, the road would be blocked again. Drivers, seated in their started cars, watched the world outside disappear into the cleaning process. They couldn't see the car ahead of them. All that could be heard was the howl of the wind, thin as a jet engine, and chunks of ice hitting the iron of the car, making a sound like stones. Minutes turned into hours. The petrol meter began to drop. The heater's warmth began to fade. Snow reached the car's tires, then the door handles. Thousands of people realized with dread that they wouldn't be going home today. They were trapped in cages made of steel and glass. The scene on the highway in Ohio was nothing short of apocalyptic. The wind used the open highway like a runway. Heavy trucks were overturned like toys, and roads were completely blocked. Snowflakes attached to these trucks grew 15 to 20 feet high. The mental state of the people inside the cars was deteriorating. At that time, there was no Google Maps, nor could anyone seek help from social media. There was only the crackling sound of the radio where people were screaming. People had to decide between life and death. Should they remain sitting in the cars? The cars were providing shelter from the wind, but as the snow started blocking the muffler pipes, a poisonous gas called carbon monoxide started spreading inside the cars. Many people simply fell asleep and never woke up. The other way was to go out on foot, but opening the door and venturing out into the storm, where you couldn't even see your own hands, felt like suicide. Still, many people decided to pedal. They tied themselves to each other with ropes and jumper cables to make sure they wouldn't get lost, and they scurried toward the dim lights that were just visible in the distance. They left their expensive cars on the road, which had now become a mound of snow. Those who stayed close to the highways suddenly became heroes. When they saw the car's headlights disappearing in the snow, they opened their doors. The strangers sheltered dozens of people in their homes. The panicked survivors were pulled out of the cars and given coffee and blankets. But the road fell silent as one by one, the car's engines stopped. The highway, once a symbol of freedom and travel, had become a graveyard. When the sun set, though no one could see it, only darkness prevailed. This storm now swept towards the houses. After the work on the roads was completed, now it was time for the houses. The first attack was on the electricity system. The power lines were broken due to the stormy winds and the weight of snow. Transformers exploded, and the entire area, after shining in blue light, was plunged into complete darkness. In 1978, the insulation of the houses was not like it is today. When the heater was turned off, the cold didn't come in by knocking on the door, but instead broke the door and entered inside. The temperature inside the houses started dropping, 60 degrees, then 50, then 40. Steam started coming out of the rooms. Water pipes started cracking inside the walls, making the sound like bullets. Basements filled with water, and then that water froze and turned into ice, due to which the foundations of the houses shook. People abandoned the upper rooms and gathered in one room, usually the kitchen or living room, where a fire could be lit. They hung blankets over the doors to keep the heat out. Mattresses were spread on the floor, and everyone huddled together. Eating became a chore. Shops were closed, and the shelves were gone. Whatever was in the house was the only food available. People ate cold beans and warmed soup over the fire. Food stored in the freezer now felt warmer than the outside air. And the noise. That noise didn't seem to stop. The wind kept blowing continuously for days. It felt as if a train was running on the roof of the house. The houses were creaking under the weight of snow. People remained confined to their homes for 3 days. Opening the door was impossible because a 10-foot-high wall of snow had formed outside the door. People had to crawl out of the second-floor windows to see if the world still existed. The radio was their only source of support. Huddled under the blankets in the darkness, people listened to the radio station's voices, constantly in the studio for 24, 48, and 72 hours, encouraging the people. But there was something interesting in these difficult times. For the Baron, this storm was a disaster, but for the children, it was no less than a magic. School was closed, so there was no worry about homework. The snowflakes were not a hindrance for them, but a place to play. The wind had hardened the snow so much that they could walk on it. Survivors slid out of windows and down the roofs of garages. They built tunnels in the snow. For the 10-year-old survivor of 1978, the storm was not a disaster, but the greatest adventure of their lives. They walked along roads where cars once whizzed by, but now held only cleanliness and silence. By the third day, the situation had deteriorated so much that the police and fire brigades had given up. Their vehicles were buried in snow. City mayors called in the army. The National Guard was deployed. This wasn't a war, but the scene resembled one. Tanks and armored vehicles were seen moving through the streets of Boston and Cleveland. The tracks of these tanks broke the frozen snow. Soldiers sat behind trucks, delivering milk and medicines to the people. Helicopters landed on school grounds to take the sick to the hospital. But the army couldn't reach everywhere. Here, ordinary people offered their help. Those who had snowmobiles became heroes. These weren't government employees, they were neighbors. They transported doctors to hospitals on their snowmobiles, took police to crime scenes, and delivered milk to distressed mothers and food to children. For a week, road laws were abolished. Only the law of humanity prevailed. If someone had a truck and their neighbor didn't, it was divided. If the car sank, 10 strangers came to push it. No money was taken. No favors were shown. This storm had erased the distances from people's hearts. Everyone was equal, everyone was cold, and everyone needed someone else.
When the storm subsided and the sun finally rose, its light shone through the snow, blinding the eyes. The silence broke and the sound of shovels echoed everywhere. The cleanup began, a task no less arduous than excavation. People began digging holes that looked like igloos. It was difficult to tell which hole was a hole and which was a letterbox. When the snow cleared, the sad reality emerged. Corpses were found inside the holes, people who slept and never woke again. Nearly 100 people died in Massachusetts and Rhode Island alone. Businesses were destroyed and building roofs collapsed. It took weeks for life to return to normal. In some places, traces of snow remained until May. This 1978 storm changed people. It taught us that no matter how much we rely on modern technology, we are helpless before nature. It showed how weak our system is, but it also showed how strong we are.
We remember this storm, not just for its records or devastation, but for how, in the darkness, we held hands. It was the storm that buried America, but it was also the storm that proved we can dig ourselves out again. For those who lived through it, it wasn't just a weather condition, it was a medal. It's the story they tell their grandchildren when they complain about a little cold. He says, "Do you think it's cold? Let me tell you about the time we looked out the second-story window. It was a difficult time, but in the mirror of time, it was a time when we saw humanity at its best. We survived that white storm, and we will never forget it."